Well, I think we're at 1:45, so we should resume. Is Mr. Elvin joining us this afternoon, Mr. Lyons?
He may be shortly, sir. Before we move on to the next agenda item, can I raise a matter regarding tomorrow's session? I'm told that there are two documents that are going through the IT process to put up onto the examination library, with your permission, sir. The first one is an updated trajectory, which I understand is reflecting monitoring data which has been received after the matters statement was submitted to the examination library, and it brings matters forward by another year. The second one is a revised windfall paper. As you may be aware, Annex 4 to the SHLA 2021 has a windfall paper, and what we've done is to update that. Rather than present a document which takes new figures and relates it back to the previous paper, we thought it would be more effective and efficient to actually just replace the paper. So although it comes forward as a new paper as such, it's effectively only revising the figures that were included in previous graphs and figures in the earlier document. And the only textual changes are those which are necessary to identify the changes in the figure work. There's been no change in the methodology, so it's a simple case of looking at the new figure work. It won't be a surprise to anyone. We don't anticipate it's actually going to affect the nature of the debates and the issues that will take place tomorrow. It's simply an update to the figures. As I say, that's going through the process of going to the examination library now, so people have a chance to look at it before tomorrow morning.
Yeah, well, thanks for drawing that to our attention. Quite happy to work on the basis of up-to-date figures, but... So.
Yeah, when will we see that?
Hopefully, I'm told if it hasn't gone on by 2 p.m, it's literally going through the process of IT putting it on the examination library, so if it's not 2 p.m, it'll be very shortly after that. We know we need to get this up ASAP, so that's being done at the moment, sir.
While we're on the subject, Mr. Keogh, you put a paper to the programme officer as well. Perhaps it would be useful if you could explain what that's about, so that everyone's aware of it.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And I fear I may have wasted a nice Sunday afternoon updating it in light of what the council have just said. Sir, all I've done is to prevent people scrabbling around various documents, including some of my own representations. I've gathered together some tables I want to speak to tomorrow in relation to 5-year supply and the trajectory. And the information essentially draws together tables that I presented in my representations and in other matters papers. And I've also done 2 variations of the Council's 5-year housing land supply using their methodology. So I've tried to keep any areas of disagreement to a minimum. Essentially, I'm looking at the trajectory and to the impact of student numbers on land supply and on the 5-year land supply.
For the sake of having a prior look at it, I told the programme officer that we could upload that to the website, rather than you try to go through the figures tomorrow and circulate it then wherever then people would want 10-15 minutes to have a look. So it's going up on the website, but I'm grateful for your explanation. I just wonder what effect Mr. Linus has just told us will have on the figures in there.
So I think what we're going to get are just different opinions on the 5-year supply with using different assumptions. I assume that's where we're going to end up tomorrow, and what we will be discussing tomorrow. Yeah.
Yes, sir. It may be that some of the figures in the tables that Mr. Keogh has produced need to be read in the light of the trajectory that is produced. But as I said, my understanding is it's not going to actually make a material difference to the issues that are in dispute, even if the figures have changed. So I don't anticipate a problem.
We'll see how we get on tomorrow. There was a couple of other things I wanted to touch on. First was whether there's any confirmation of what's happened to the Fulford ACMA. Do we know?
have been told by others in the team that the position that Mr. Ridge expressed is correct. We'll go and see if there's any other documentary confirmation we provide the examination on that, but I understand you can proceed on the basis that it is no longer in being.
I was just going to say we can link through to City of York Council's air quality monitoring page, which provides all the data on the air quality management areas and how they've changed.
They're made through order, aren't they? If I understand the process correctly. So presumably what you have to withdraw the order, is that how it works?
It is, yes. You have to formally revoke the order. Yeah.
Yes, perhaps to help, rather than just take that, we'll go back and see if we can put it into a short note that confirms the position and provides the relevant links so it's all tidied up.
I think that would be useful. Yeah. Yes, just for reference purposes.
We'll take that away.
The other thing did in the lunch adjournment was have a look at the statement of common ground with National Highways. Read through that. I hope, Mr. Corsier, well, you've obviously seen it. You had a prior look. There were some things in there that made me wonder about the areas where agreement hasn't been reached yet. Seemed, I mean, on the face of it, quite substantial. And I wondered whether that is going to have an impact on the discussion we have next Tuesday about infrastructure, whether you're happy that conversation can go on Tuesday as programmed.
Simon Jones of National Highways is joining us on Tuesday.
Right, okay.
Yes, sir. Even if discussions are ongoing with National Highways at the time, I haven't been given any instruction that we're at a stage where that discussion on infrastructure would not be helpful.
Okay.
And if National Highways are appearing, we anticipate it would be of some help to you to understand what the current position is. Yes, I don't think we need to say anything further than that.
Okay, well, I'm happy to proceed on that basis. But if anything crops up as we go through this week, then of course you let us know. Probably the logical place to start is with that statement of common ground. Mr. Corsier, you held back some commentary about it in the lead up to lunch while we're on the subject. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. Can I just come back on the Fulford ACMA? I think I've confirmed that the Council are indeed correct, that it has been withdrawn. I checked that over lunch. But the general point I was making still stands because obviously there is the other ACMA in York, which is also adversely affected by traffic. And it would, of course, be very bad planning for levels of traffic to actually require a new ACMA to be required for Fulford, indeed for any other area as well. So the central point I was making still stands. So can I just take you to this statement of common ground? I think you've already picked up the big point I was trying to make to you about it, which is that the areas which are not yet agreed. But just clarification, sir, on paragraph 11 of that, and this relates to discussions for next week. It says that National Highways has provided the Council and site promoter with a benchmark cost estimate of the new A64 junction. So that would be very useful if the Council could put that on the website so that everybody has that available for discussions on viability, because the Council do make reference to costings of that junction within their statement, which presumably predated this estimate from National Highways.
We can take that away. So obviously, as Mr. Corsier anticipates, some of the matters that are identified in the Statement of Common Ground will be the subject of discussions next week on the infrastructure session. And to the extent that information can be made available at this stage, Mr. Ridge tells me that we will help the examination as much as possible. I'll get closer, sir.
So then, in that case, I think where we actually, if you look at the section dealing on areas on which the Council and National Highways are yet to reach agreement are very substantial. So, and I would emphasise we're now 4 years after submission. It's the impact of the local plan on the strategic road network, including the full extent of mitigation may be required. Whether schemes to mitigate significant impacts of local plan development on the A64 can be developed, and that's obviously isn't that casts doubt on whether they can actually be developed. That's not yet clarified, and delivered within the required timescales. And indeed, the costs of a DMRB compliant grade separated junction to serve ST15. The distinction, sir, is that, just to make clear, is the cost estimate already produced by National Highways isn't the detailed junction which has been discussed with the site promoters, which is it would not necessarily produce a DMRB compliant junction. So that's why that is there, sir. So my conclusion looking at that document, sir, is that at the present moment you have not sufficient information, evidence to be certain that the spatial distribution as it stands is satisfactory. And obviously, sir, until those matters which are set out in the Statement of Common Ground are settled, sir, you'll still be in that position. And I must emphasise we are 4 years on from submission. It raised the question whether the duty to cooperate was actually fulfilled in relation to National Highways. Thank you, sir.
And what Mr. Kersey hasn't done is obviously look at the areas of agreement that are identified in the Statement of Common Ground. And the first point to note is that National Highways are fundamentally accepting that the strategic model that's being used by the Council is fit for purpose for local plan forecasting, as well as specific models for interchanges, including Fulford, as well as the Fulford Road corridor. So there are substantial areas of agreement which have already been reached with National Highways. As far as other areas are concerned, the areas which are still under discussion are largely the result of the updating work that's being carried out. And whilst further discussions are taking place, we can update the examination on how those are proceeding at the infrastructure session. As the Statement of Common Ground anticipates, the parties have set out the work that needs to be undertaken in order to resolve the areas of outstanding disagreement. So much work has been done. Discussions are taking place. And the updating work that is being carried out, we say can inform discussions at the infrastructure session next week. So we don't accept the characterisation, the way that Mr. Coursier puts it, given that substantial agreement on the process that's been followed by the Council has been reached, and a roadmap has effectively been set out which identifies the work that has to be carried out in order for National Highways to be satisfied, and that will be dealt with both next week and as matters progress towards the site-specific sessions in the next phases. Mr. Ridge wants to add to that.
I'd also just like to make the point that since 2018 there's obviously been tremendous change in the way that people travel around. And so the update of the model is necessary to look at that. Furthermore, within City of York Council, as Professor May referred to earlier, we've commissioned a new and much more powerful and more detailed transport model, which we can look at that. And the third part of it is we've actually moved on with delivering some of the schemes that are going to be necessary to deal with some of the traffic generated by the local plan. In particular, we now have detailed proposals for taking forward dualling of the Northern Ring Road. and we are able to incorporate that within the model in a way that we were not when we did the modelling in 2018.
Thank you, and I'm not going to go over the debate that took place this morning on the evidence base for the plan, but as Mr. Elvin submitted previously, it's not as if transport issues have simply arisen at this stage. They've been the subject of assessment at earlier stages, and as I mentioned myself, this is an update to work that has been carried out at previous stages of the local plan process.
Mr. Merrick, go on.
It seems very clear from the Statement of Common Understanding that there has been quite a substantial shift in the assumed traffic distribution that's now generating problems at the three A64 junctions. That then raises the question, what is the model showing in terms of the rest of the area, and does that affect the ratings that have been used in the sustainability assessment for a whole series of sites?
We want to deal with that, please?
So I think it is the case that the model, well, if we go back a stage, the original modelling was done, which is what National Highways are commenting on the basis of the Saturn model, which we are now in the process of replacing. So to some extent, those results are going to be updated, and the results that we get from the new modelling, which we will present to phase 3 of the inquiry, will be different. Now, I've seen the early modelling. The results are not substantially different in terms of changes in congestion and delay on the corridors, but there are some incremental differences. But as I say, we'll be presenting more evidence on this in later phases.
Does anyone else have anything to add about this statement of common ground? We'll be coming back to it, no doubt, on Tuesday next week and beyond that. Good. Well, in which case, I want to move on and returning to the matters and issues and get on to the third heading that I outlined this morning, which was the site selection process. And if I've got the right document in front of me, that's 4.11 to 4.13. I'll come to the council first, whether there's anything you want to say by way of background.
Thank you, sir. I'll ask Mr. Wood just to set out the broad summary position covering all the questions you identified.
Thank you. The site selection process involves two key documents or processes. That's both the SHLA, which is SD 49A, and also the sustainability appraisal, which is largely the appendices at CD 9, many of which were referred to by Mr. Elvin this morning. So I'll try and make sure I get my references the same. So if we just sort of, I guess, just really try to explain what's in what, really, and then obviously we can discuss things going forward. So when we sort of look at the first two stages of the site allocation work, are set out in the SHLA, and really the whole idea around the SHLA is around identifying potential housing land and providing an assessment of it, but not then making the actual decisions about which sites should be then taken forward and allocated in the plan. So I'll come back to that. So it's sort of been described, some of the intro to it sort of describes it as a database of sites addressed for their potential for housing. So that's the sort of general nature of the SHLA. But what there is within the SHLA is then a two-stage suitability assessment,
which was really there in place to really identify reasonable alternative sites for development. So the first stage of that methodology is a sustainable location assessment, stage 1. And if it helps, this is all that's set out in the SLA, so SD 49A, paragraph 2.34 onwards, gives an explanation of this. But really what there are criteria as part of this location assessment. Again, these are all listed in documents. I'll try not to sort of just read them all out. But when you look at the criteria, you do see the link across to the spatial shapers and the sort of types of issues that we've been talking about this morning. So you've got criteria 1 of focused around environmental assets. So we've got the historic character and setting, nature conservation sites, green corridors, ancient woodlands and floodplain. You've got criteria 2 around retaining existing open space, and criteria 3 minimising greenfield development in areas of high flood risk. So that's the sort of first set of things that the sites go through. If they get through those, then they go to criteria 4A and 4B, which is about access to services and facilities, including education, convenience, provision, open space. And then the second one is then 4B is transport accessibility, which is access to buses, both sort of standard services, park and ride services, train stations, cycle routes, adopted highway, the details in the document. In terms of understanding where the results of that exercise are, they're in the back of the SLA in SD 49, so that work is set out there. We then move then to the second stage that is described and sits under the SLA, which is a technical officer assessment. So all those that have passed stage 1 went through to that exercise. There's a technical officer group that was drawn of different officers with different expertise from around the council to really give a more detailed and site-specific view around the suitability of the site as a potential development site. There's conservation, again, the officers involved are listed in that document, but there was a spread from conservation design, sustainable development, transport, environmental protection, economic development, so a spread of sort of different areas. So then we then have the results from that are set out in the annexes to the site selection paper in 2013, which is the main paper is SD 72A and the annexes are set out at 72B. So that's where we get to through the SLA process. We then have really, in effect, then the sustainability appraisal then playing the role in terms of actually informing and setting out the selection of sites that would then be allocated in the draft local plan. And I appreciate that may be done differently through different plans. Sometimes it's done in the SLA. In this case, this has been set out in the essay. So all the proposed strategic sites and also the other allocations and alternatives have then been subject to this essay process. So you'll then...
So can I, apologies, can I just ask, in terms of the alternatives, are those all of the alternatives that were considered through the SLA?
No, it's the ones that have gone through the first two stages of the exercise.
So first of all, sites go through the SLA, and the ones that pop out are considered to be the reasonable alternatives?
Yes, they're the potential sites for development. So we then have the essay process kicking in using the essay objectives. All these reasonable alternative sites were assessed against the 15 essay objectives, and in the essay report there's different detailed criteria set against those. And then we've sort of touching on things we've gone through this morning, we've then got the more detailed assessment of the strategic site allocations, and the reasonable alternatives for those are set out at Appendix I of the essay. So this provides the assessment by which strategic sites sets out the assessment work through which the strategic sites have been allocated and then included in the plan. I think it was touched on this morning that in terms of there's been a different series and iteration of stages on the sustainability appraisal, and that exercise sort of showing what's happened to these different sites is set out at Appendix K, which was also referred to by Mr. Elvin this morning. So in terms of I think you've already had you might have had a look in terms of Appendix I, and that detailed assessment considers the essay objectives, the site assessment criteria, and also a commentary looking at sort of significant effects and more detailed issues as we touched on this morning. And then the reasons in effect for the selection of the proposed strategic allocations are then contained in the columns set out in Appendix K, which sets out that audit trail of the decision-making process going through. So that's hopefully a summary of how the site selection process has been put into place by the council.
Thank you. Who would like to start off on this point?
Me.
Go on then.
Yeah, just so I'm absolutely clear. So you have the SHLA process as you've just described. You then have the essay process that undertakes, as essays do, a kind of scoring sort of evaluation of the sites against different objectives, etc. That, though, doesn't necessarily tell you which sites to select, does it? So you have officer decisions made somewhere along the line, I guess, and then you're telling me, I think, that that's recorded in Appendix K of the essay itself. Is that right?
That's right. So you've seen the different stages where views were taken on the sites, and because it includes the documents, not just the essay documents in Appendix K. So it gives you that trail of what decisions were made at what points on different sites, which you're right, does reflect officer and member decisions that were taken in association with those stages. It's just all summed up and wrapped up in the essay document.
In the essay itself? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Ms. Fern, did you want to say something?
Yes, thank you. Are we taking questions on all of that section, I presume?
I'm happy to deal with it all together, yeah.
That's fine. I've got quite a few queries, actually, that I want to raise. I presume it's okay to just raise them all at once and then get a response. Yeah. So as you're probably aware, we have significant issues with the site selection process and how the council have gone about implementing that. With specific reference to the 35/100 hectare threshold for sites that they consider to be large enough to accommodate self-sustaining settlements. These sites were essentially fast-tracked through the system because they're essentially capable of creating their own facilities and amenities and services that would deem them to be self-sustaining settlements. We asked at the previous hearing sessions for evidence as to why the council had decided just before the submission of the local plan to change the threshold from 100 hectares to 35 hectares, quite a significant change. And there was no audit trail, there was no evidence to back that up in any way and to justify it. The evidence that the council have provided in the form of the it's EXEYC 37, which is the audit trail of sites, is in my view a bit wishy-washy. It's set out at 2.18 of the document. It ranges from everything from technical evidence by the council and submitted by developers, collaborative working between officers and site developers. There's no concrete evidence there, in my opinion. There's a document that's referred to, which is or part of a document, which is the Strategic Site Delivery Framework, which is part of the SHLA, which is SD 49A, which sets out the process of ongoing engagement in meetings, workshops, etc. That document was prepared in 2013. It took the council until, during this, if they did engage with developers, it took them from 2013, where they set out this framework, until just before the submission of the local plan, to decide that this threshold needed to be decreased from 100 to 35 hectares. Obviously quite a significant, dramatic change in what is essentially a very important mechanism within the site selection process, which deals with extremely large sites. They're very strategic in nature. They form a large part of the council's housing requirement coming forward. They're very important. Whether this was just an oversight or not, I don't know. But the evidence that's been provided within the audit trail just doesn't meet my expectations. As somebody that's reviewing this local plan, it doesn't give me the confidence that that reduction in threshold was justified or necessary. The other thing that was evidenced was the release of a publication by the government called Locally Led Garden Villages, Towns and Cities in 2016, where what it essentially alludes is that a site of between 1,500 and 10,000 dwellings could be...
Forgive me, I'm always really interested in government publications. So could you just run the title of that one past me? Is that in the...
It's in the audit trail document under 2.19, sorry, 2.18 of the council's document, which is EX-CYC 37, is where they reference it. And this is evidence put forward to justify the 35 hectare threshold. So that document alludes that between 1,500 and 10,000 homes would be, or it actually says could be, capable of being considered as a standalone sustainable settlement. But when you look at the details, if you apply the 35 dwellings per hectare density, which is used throughout the council's evidence and in the local plan, to the 35 hectares, which they consider to be acceptable for a sustainable settlement, you actually only get just over 1,200 homes. So that doesn't fit with that evidence at all. And if we go back as an example to ST14, ST14 proposes to bring forward 1,300 homes under the council's proposal, again falling short of that evidence that they've provided. Let me just check my notes.
Can I just ask, you say that the government publication says between 1,500 and 10,000, did you say?
10,000, that's what it states, yes.
That should give us all something to think about, that range.
It's very broad,
presumably the 10,000 isn't some sort of upper limit. Is it talking about lower limits, that the lower limit is probably between 1,500 and 10,000?
It's a very generalised comment within the document, put it that way. And the word is could accommodate. It's not that they think that is the threshold between which a sustainable settlement should be.
Good, thanks.
You're welcome.
Well, I'll come to you, Mr. Linus, because I think there's some detailed points in there that you might want to deal with before we move on to other submissions.
Yes, I'll ask Mr. Wood to pick up the detail, but just refer you, sir, to the relevant paragraphs in EXCYC 57, which confirm at 2.18, amongst other paragraphs, that The sieve was refined to 35 hectares compared with earlier stages for a range of reasons, which reflect the fact this is a broad judgment to be exercised. The judgment was exercised having regard to information about the evolution of sites submitted at the various consultation stages, the technical evidence that was before the council and submitted by developers, as well as working between officers and site developers through the delivery framework for strategic sites and ongoing engagement and meetings and workshops. The reference to the locally led garden villages, towns and cities was part of a wider consideration of where a threshold needed to be struck, and it was refined based on a number of discussions covering a number of matters. And as was explained earlier on by Mr. Wood, the locally led garden villages document was predicated on entirely self-sustaining garden villages, which, as he explained, was not the purpose behind the allocations. That document was just one of a wide range of factors that were taken into account when deciding whether or not to assess sites through the defined criteria in the SHLA, or whether to let them go through to their own separate assessment. So it wasn't a case of sites being missed. There was a broad range of factors which reduced the threshold, and then these sites were then fed into the assessment at a later stage.
Thank you. I'd just like to try and explain what 35 hectares means and what it doesn't mean. What it doesn't mean, it is not a free pass to an allocation. If we follow the process through that I've outlined, so we have a site, and if it's, say, 50 hectares, it needs to go through the first three criteria in the SHLA, the environmental criteria. We then look at the criteria 4 around the access to services and the provision of sustainable transport. What that 35 hectares, and it is a judgment, I'll come back to that, what that does is say, well, actually, we just need to think a little bit differently about this idea of access to services and the provision of public transport, because at a certain scale, we are more likely to get a level of service provision on the site or contribution to infrastructure, the provision of transport services. What it then does, though, is then, so if you perhaps might have not scored well on those criteria 4, but you're over 35 hectares, what it does, it just gets you through to the next stage, which is in that wider pot of reasonable alternatives. As I said earlier, it does not deliver you an allocation. It gets you into the mix as a reasonable alternative, and then we go through then the SA processes and the appendices, etc., that we've run through. So it is not a free pass to an allocation. Hopefully that explains the approach. I think it's as Mr. Lyon has said, it's a judgment around just trying to give some indication and some level, drawing on various documents and probably thinking at the time that there's some level of development here that might deliver something different and something enhanced. But as I say, it doesn't detract from then the further detailed assessment work that then went on any of those reasonable alternative sites. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem, thank you. Whilst I appreciate that it doesn't give you a free pass, it does bypass sites past 4A and 4B of the assessment criteria, which relate to accessibility and provision of services and amenities, because those sites are meant to be capable of bringing forward their own facilities and services and amenities so that people don't have to travel distance to go and access them. Sites such as ST14 are not located sustainably. It's been in our previous representations. We've had a transport and highways engineer and consultant do the relevant assessments. It's not in an accessible location, full stop. It's not attached to the existing urban area of York. It is a standalone settlement. Therefore, it should be capable of bringing forward the necessary facilities that it needs to. If, for example, there was a site that was just 35 hectares in size, that site would bypass the 4A and 4B criteria. It would go through the process. It wouldn't be assessed against accessibility, and its feasibility in connecting to existing services. And it would have a free pass through that situation, but 35 hectares, I've just demonstrated, is not capable of delivering a site of more than just over 1,200 dwellings, not including services and facilities and amenities. It's not capable of becoming a standalone sustainable settlement. It's not large enough. It's there in figures in our evidence. And that's the point I was making.
I'll ask Mr. Wood to deal with that, but I think it doesn't really sort of understand what the purpose of the assessment was, that the larger sites were not excused from assessment. They were let through to another stage of assessment on the grounds that at that size a judgment had been reached that they could be made capable of being sustainable. And that would then have been taken into account as part of the later analysis. So it wasn't that, as Mr. Wood has said, sites were being given a free pass through to allocation. It was simply a recognition that there was the potential for sites of that size to be made accessible, even if they'd failed accessibility criteria under the earlier assessment.
Thank you. I think you've just covered the point there where I accept the point around 4A and 4B. I think that's what I said in describing it. I think we were clear in the discussions this morning that the objective is not that these are fully self-contained settlements. That's not the approach being taken. Clearly, we want to see a good level of service provision and positive transport links. We covered that this morning, and really it's just I think the additional point I can make is that when the sites then go back into to the SA process, you've then got the assessment against the SA objectives, and if I won't go to them now, but there's a transport sustainability objective and the sub-criteria under that, so in terms of sort of access to public transport, reducing the need to travel, etc., those factors are then reconsidered through the SA process. So the SA then does a comprehensive assessment looking at the range of issues covered by the objectives.
Just so I'm absolutely clear. So it does get you through the 4A and 4B criteria. After that, you say, though, through the SA process, that still gets looked at. When you say through the SA process, do you mean the officer judgment part that's put in the SA?
Well, by the SA, so the SA process, which is reflecting both the officer assessment work that's been reflected in the SA and the actual SA independent assessment that's also been done.
And the 4A and 4B criteria, those are about transport?
One's about access to services and facilities, and one is about transport.
And so is Ms Fern right that it gets past those because there's an assumption that they could be made sustainable by the provision of transport and other facilities and services?
I'd agree. I think the expression I would probably is more sustainable, not to the point where we're looking them to be self-contained and freestanding in that respect, but the likelihood of providing services and facilities on the site, and also the likelihood of better transport links, better public transport links, that the scale would support both of those things.
Mr. Good, I'll come to you next.
Thank you, sir. My comments also around the 35 hectares, and it revolves around, it's a slightly different point, but revolves around how equitable that's actually been used across the different sites. And the reason I say this is my client has a site which I use as an example. There may be other examples. I don't know how else to phrase it, sir, if I'm honest.
You could always pick one of the other ones, Mr. Good.
I could do, but I haven't looked into them in the same detail, sir, so I wouldn't like to mislead you in any fashion. The reason I go here, as much as anything else, is within the council's, the document we've just been looking at, CYC 37, there is a wider site which includes two elements of my client's site, which is 119, and it says within that audit that that site was not submitted for assessment, therefore it wasn't assessed, it wasn't deemed to be a reasonable alternative. This is within our hearing statement, sir. However, my client put forward two separate sites, 902 and 322, which in combination made the same site as the 119 site. Now, the reason for my client doing that was to provide the council with potential options that it could consider going forward. Now, in conjunction, those two did make over 35 hectares, but the key point being, at the time when they were submitted, that 35 hectares wasn't an issue. It wasn't something which the council were actively looking at. Therefore, my client couldn't use that as a reason why it may or may not fulfill the relevant criteria. Site 902...
Was it 100 at that time?
It was, sir, yes. Site 902 failed accessibility criteria 4, which is what we've just been hearing about, sir, and was therefore dismissed on that basis. That, to me, doesn't seem like an equitable process, and I can't find anywhere, and I'm sure the council will point me in the right direction if they can, where they've then considered sites which are next to each other and whether those could be cumulatively make up the 35 hectares and hence move on a stage. If that isn't the case, that seems rather unequitable given the late choice of change of threshold.
Do you want to come back on that, Mr. Linus, or shall I go to Mr. Corsia next? Okay. Mr. Corsia, go ahead.
So, a brief point. I think that the site selection process is remarkably opaque, sir. You cannot really trace through where the important decisions have been taken. We are told we refer to the SA audit, but that doesn't, when you actually read the SA audit, it just tells you the very bare facts of we've changed it for not particularly good reason, but the key political decisions or the key technical decisions, whatever you wish to take, there's no documentation to actually explain how these sites have been selected, why they've been preferred. We are referred to committee reports, if you look at the council's papers, to actually get this information. That isn't the right way. There should be... I've tried to understand how ST15 has evolved through the process. It's almost impossible, sir. And this, unless you've been involved in planning in York, taking minutiae in month by month. It is very difficult to find what is the basis for the key decisions on selections of sites. And so I would love to come and criticise the site selection process, but I don't understand it, sir. I have to say, however much I've looked at it, I don't feel I've got a basis to actually criticise it other than say I don't understand it. I don't understand why key decisions have been made about the plan. So that's that one point, sir. 412, do you wish to deal with 412 now or subsequently? Well, sir, Greenbelt, the site selection process obviously took place pre-2018, pre-submission. So the one fact we do know, because I was aired at the Phase 1 hearings and yourself as inspectors have made judgments on that, is that the council had, at the time of submission, seriously was misinterpreting national policy in relation to Greenbelt purposes. It must follow inevitably from that the council should have reconsidered the sites against the proper understanding of greenbelt purposes, and they haven't done that, sir. You have got no document in relation to how the sites, the strategic sites, relate to greenbelt purposes, and that isn't even provided in the new evidence, which we'll deal with under a lost matter. I think it's matter 7, I think. The only evidence, the council, almost entirely in the, for much of the site selection exercise, the council have referred to 3.1, this submission local plan figure 3.1, sir. And we now know, of course, that doesn't identify all the important areas of greenbelt. So we say that the council haven't properly taken into account greenbelt issues in the site selection process. And if they had, sir, they would have come to very different decisions on some of the sites. And so that particularly, I think, you know, is very important when you're dealing with you know, the new settlement sites in particular. Thank you.
Mr. Linus?
Thank you, sir. I'll ask Mr. Wood to chip in with other answers. Just dealing with the points in turn. As you'll see from the site selection paper, the council did include as part of its methodology the ability to amalgamate sites, and judgments were reached on where it was appropriate to do so. That is set out in SD 72A section 7. So there was an element of amalgamation built into the process, and it was just a question of judgment on the council as to where that was appropriately done for the purposes of carrying through the assessment. Secondly, to pick up Mr. Kersey's points, as Mr. Wood has explained, and as we've heard already at the examination, it's not unusual for local plans to have a series of documents which indicate how sites have been selected as part of a wider process. Here, Mr. Wood has explained the approach taken to the site selection paper, the sustainability appraisal, the SHLA, and reference has already been made to officers' reports which set out responses to consultation that have taken place as the plan has found its way through its various stages of iteration. So we don't accept the proposition that Mr. Kersey puts forward that the process that's been followed in decision making has been opaque. As for his point in relation to the green belt boundaries, essentially the process of site selection is closely linked to the question of boundary assessment, and was it's accepted that Council obviously revisited the methodology and revised the methodology in response to the concerns that you, sir, your colleague previously expressed, subject to some changes which can be debated at the session on Wednesday. There was not any sort of fundamental change which was going to affect the site selection process insofar as that was closely bound up to the boundary definition. So therefore we don't accept that it was necessary to go back through the work that had already been done and somehow present an entirely repeated assessment when the boundary definition did not lead to substantial changes under the new methodology.
Thank you, Richard Wood, for the council. I think just points that I would add to that is that we're looking, I guess, through the whole approach of the plan for this alignment between the allocation of sites, so using the SHLA and the sustainability appraisal and the greenbelt boundary setting and the spatial strategy. So we're sort of looking for alignment amongst those and a sort of a common approach. Clearly we'll be looking at the greenbelt boundary setting exercise later in the week, but just really to sort of draw out that in terms of the essay, the objectives 14 and 15, which are around conserving and enhances your historic environment, cultural heritage, character, and setting, and 15 protect and enhance York's natural and built landscape. That's been a particular focus of the essay, which relates to purpose 4, and then the detailed site assessment criteria that the essay has used in the site selection approach has been the heritage impact appraisal, which is based on the 6 principal characteristics of the heritage topic paper, and 3 of those read across into the Greenbelt methodology. So there's just really, I guess, a linking of things going on here to make sure that they're all aligning and producing consistent results.
Good. Okay. I'll move on up that side of the table, if I may. Yes, go on.
Thank you. So Paul Butler, TW Fields, ST7, ST14. I just wanted to obviously make the point we're all aware of that. I think we're straying on to a lot of phase 3 items here. In some instances, some matter 6 items too, which will be covered next week. But the case has largely been made to support our position wanting to expand our site. So our second option is other than the 1348 and a slight expansion of the size of that to 65 hectares. The ST14 is to go to 1,725 homes. But even then, the reference to 1,500 homes is more of a quantitative point rather than a qualitative assessment, because it's quite clear that the assessment of these sites, ST7 and 14, have been taken on that qualitative basis. So in reference to ST14, our southern boundary is within 400 metres of Clifton Moor. And we're also, as part of the scheme, which is in a Matter 6 infrastructure delivery programme, we'll be delivering a separate cycle and pedestrian connection to Clifton Moor with its own separate underpass underneath the new, the ring road / dual ring road. So that connection's there to ensure that that site is not only sustainable, but also is highly accessible. There'll be bus routes as well. And that doesn't obviously include the provision on site as well, which we'll discuss in due course of phase 3 REES schools and local centres and things like that. So and the other key point really for me is that while we're calling it a freestanding settlement, it goes back to the point made by Mr. Linus and Mr. Wood, though whilst a freestanding settlement, it doesn't stand in the middle of nowhere. It does have the ability to be connected readily easy, sorry, apologies, for a site of that size in reference to the distance from the urban edge. So similar points can be made about ST7. There's a layering of qualitative assessment that needs to take place, and I think that's when you take into account all the matters we're discussing now, but also more importantly, probably the phase 3 element as well.
Thank you. Mr. Merritt, is your...
It is, thank you, sir. I have got some of the comments on the Greenbelt and openness, but I'll probably come back to those later just so we don't stray from this topic, because it's a couple of responses similar to Mr. Butler, really, which is, in response to how the council have dealt with this, they looked at 100 hectares as the site, but reduced that down to 35 hectares. But as they've said, that wasn't a free pass. But what they've actually done is they've then looked at the sites that were put forward and done a site assessment of that, looked at the land available, the nearby facilities, and then looked at what they considered to be an appropriate size and boundary. So on ST14, for example, the site could be bigger, the land's available to be bigger, more homes could be delivered, but the council, in assessing that and looking at what's nearby, have considered that actually the correct, well, their considered correct number, about 1348, is sustainable and fits with their assessment. And I think we shouldn't look at the 1,500 in that government document as being, if you don't hit 1,500, it can't be sustainable, because ultimately you've got to look at what's nearby, and that's what the council could have done. They could have easily allocated this site for 1,501 homes, but they've chosen not to because they've made that analysis. The discussion almost implied that we just sneaked in at 35 dwellings per hectare, and it's almost in the middle of nowhere, describing it as unsustainable. I mean, Mr. Butler's just mentioned the footpaths. We're probably closer to a mega bowl than many of these sites are to a local shop. I mean, that's how sustainable it is. Once you go, you will see it. Once we get to the phase 3 sessions, there's supermarkets, eateries, pubs, cinema, all within walking distance, which I think most settlements would probably give their left arm to be near. So I think just to describe it as being unsustainable because it's under a 1,500 threshold without looking at what's nearby is a wholly incorrect way of looking at this site. And therefore the 100 hectares, the 35 hectares is slightly misleading once you get into the detail of it.
What's a mega bowl?
So it's a bowling alley, sir. I'm glad I didn't go with Laser Quest now, but there's one of those there as well.
Sir, I can speak from personal and somewhat bitter experience of that.
I was going to Google it rather than ask, but there we are. Mr. Merritt.
I think we would also appreciate if there was a more explicit exemplification of the choices that have been made at this later stage. I mean, comment was made about making judgments about whether sites could be made accessible, and we'll probably come back to it at a later stage in the inquiry, but there's been a 15% assumption of public transport use for certain of the key sites. And yet, if you actually look at the last census data, there is only one area of York which manages to do better than 10% bus usage, and that's the university. And that's basically because it's got a largely car-less student population. You know, everywhere else in the city, even somewhere like Haxby, which has probably the best set of bus services of anywhere outside the city centre, outside the main city, it can still only achieve 10% bus share of journeys to work. And that has services not just to the city centre, that has services to Clifton Moor and to Monk's Cross. None of the other settlements outside, because of their small nature, can support something that good. So whether you can seriously achieve a 50% better result than anywhere else in York on some of these sites in terms of the sustainability argument is, I think, stretching credibility.
I'll come back to the council now to respond to those, and then there's a few nameplates up on this side of the table. So
I don't think there's really much to say. Certainly what Mr. Butler and Mr. Nakis have said seem to largely support the approach that's been taken by the council. And so far as references is made with Mr. Merritt about individual sites not being able to achieve a particularly high level of public transport accessibility, then obviously that's a difference of judgment at a strategic level between him and the council. I won't go over the process that we've gone to reach those judgments, and in any event we can pick this up as part of the site-specific matters later on. So I don't think we need to add anything more, sir.
Sorry, Mr. Lyons, just the one thing I wasn't very clear on, it's probably my fault entirely, but it was Mr. Good's point. I think he said it didn't seem fair. But you know, the point that he made about those sites not being reconsidered when the threshold was dropped. I just wanted to know, just really, I suppose, factually, what happened.
We may need to check the position, sir, but obviously, as I said, what appears to have happened is that as part of the SLA process, which occurred at 2018, the 35 hectares threshold had been added at that stage. Sites which fell beneath the 35 hectares were considered as part of the SLA, but subject to the other criteria. But the Council had considered, when applying the four criteria, whether or not there was scope for amalgamation as part of that, and it reached its judgments on which sites could be amalgamated and put through that process. So by the time of the SLA, work was reconsidering the sites beyond what had been done at earlier stages, including in 2013 and 2014. The 35 hectares was adopted then, but sites which fell beneath 35 hectares were put into the other criteria subject to judgment being reached on amalgamation.
I think you said you need to check that, is that
yes,
right?
we can do that, sir. Take that away.
Please, yeah. Would that be something that you would check this afternoon, or do you need to go away and
We'll
do a
try
short
and do
note?
that this afternoon, but if we can't do it this afternoon, sir, we'll come back to tomorrow probably.
Yeah, I suspect that either. I don't know what. If we could have a short note on it,
Yes,
that would be
it
very
might be easier
helpful.
that way, sir. Okay, we'll take that away, sir.
Good. Well, I said I'd come to the other side of the table now. Is it Mr. Johnson?
Yes, sir, it is. I just wanted to say, I was going to make a point in the 4.12, and I'm assuming people have, and so far I'm at the right stage of the examination to do that.
Yeah.
Well, and if I may, sir, I'm going to relate it directly to one of my sites, because I think it works as a very good example as to whether or not serving the Greenbelt purposes.
Don't we always think that our site is the very best example?
I think, sir, this one is, if you just bear with me for a moment. ST8, and you can pick that up from the key diagram.
Sorry, can you move the microphone?
ST8, sir, which is Monk's Cross. It's on the key diagram. I don't need to take you to other documents, but within the SA, it considered alternatives. One of the alternatives we put forward was actually to merge what's regarded as a urban extension back to the boundary of the urban area. And I'm looking at the sustainability appraisal under Appendix I, and I don't see the scoring system being any different for the suggestion of a slightly larger allocation where it bolts back onto the urban edge than what the Council's sustainability appraisal is for the site itself. But it comes to the point under 4.12 is, has the degree to which land does or does not serve the purpose of being included in the Greenbelt? Well, in this particular case, it's a very narrow, thin slither of land that actually serves none of the purposes of Greenbelt. And when you look at the sustainability appraisal, reference is made to actually giving the residents a buffer, the existing residents needing a buffer. And there are cases, whether it's in ST14 or ST7 even, as to where certain allocations have been pushed further outwards in order to provide a buffer. But in this particular case, I think ST8 is a good example as to whether or not that sense check has been made, as to whether or not, when they've drawn up all of the boundaries, as to what's actually left in between the allocation and the urban edge, in fact, meets a green belt purpose. And then, as I say, there may be others, but in this particular case, I think it just answers that question quite neatly.
A good example, then. Thank you. The gentleman two up from Mr. Johnson. Yes, go ahead. Can you introduce yourself? I can't see your nameplate. I apologise.
Yeah, sorry. So it's Alistair Willis, Lichfields, on behalf of Bellway. It's just a very quick point, actually. I've been following all the discussion this afternoon about the various different documents, and really it's just ensuring that if and when we get to a point of an adoption, that the evidence is remaining up to date. The particular point I'm looking at here is, and it is set out in our reps as well, it's the Appendix K to the SA, which is dated February 2018. It's got, again, I'll use my site because it is the example which I have here. There may well be others, though, which is the point. So page 238 of that Appendix K, top of that table is site reference 810 east of Urswick. The description given within the document, and bear in mind as well that this site was included in the further sites consultation as a possible allocation in 2016. The annotation within this Appendix K is no longer a willing landowner, site withdrawn. Now, Lichfields have been submitting representations on this site since 2017. It is a slightly different boundary to that shown within this document, in fairness, and it may be that part of the wider ownership is no longer has a willing landowner, but certainly a large chunk of it does. And it may well be that there are others, and I question how up-to-date the evidence is and whether actually it does end up delivering the most appropriate strategy as part of a local plan going forward. That was all, sir.
There's a nameplate up one beyond you. Yes, please.
Mr. Lane, sir, Mr. Lane from DPP. Just picking up something Mr. Corsier raised, and strange enough, I'd like to agree with him here, that actually, when you go through the paper chase and look at the sites which were allocated in the 2013 and 2014 drafts, and then you try and pick out why some of those sites have been deleted, you find that, well, the evidence is in committee reports, but that evidence is sometimes considerably wanting. A prime example to that, sir, would be H28 at Weldrake, which is surrounded on 3 sides by built development and a 4th side by a hedge and a drainage ditch. It's been proposed by officers numerous times, but clearly members didn't like the site. So the evidence to justify why that site's been deleted is wanting in that particular case. There are numerous other examples, sir, and I think we'll turn to them in the site-specific situations, such as ST13, H26, etc., where the evidence is lacking for their deletions, and I would have expected to find it in all one document. Thank
you. Is that Mr. Keogh? Is that your nameplate?
It is, sir. Thank you. As everybody else is jumping in with their exclusion sites, I'll do the same. So we made it, as I said it in my evidence, we made it as far as a recommendation for inclusion in the plan in order to make the plan more sound in terms of housing numbers. We made it as far as the January 2018 local plan, which I've referenced several times in my representations. So I haven't engaged much in the debate today because many of the points that I wanted to make have been made by others. For example, I take on board the Council's point in response to the issue on the what constitutes a sustainable size for a freestanding settlement in the context of York. I think the point made by Mr. Wood earlier today was quite relevant in that the size of a site in the York context may be different to the size of a site in another urban area, and the size of sites chosen for allocation, and even some of those sites, such as ours, that have not been chosen, I think do reflect that the scale of the sites reflects the scale and context of the city to which they are related. So I just wanted to make that point. But I also have a question for yourselves. We have been referring to Phase 3 and Phase 4 hearings where there will be detailed consideration of sites. Does that include, sir, non-allocated sites that have been put forward?
No.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit more explanation.
Just a bit.
The process here is for us to determine whether or not the plan as submitted is sound. If we conclude that it is not in relation to, say, the sites and that they are all wrong, then we will not tell the council which other sites should go in. We would look to the council in a situation like that to put forward main modifications to replace those sites with new ones, if that's the sort of situation we were in. So that's the logic, really, as to why we don't spend time at this stage talking about alternatives.
Thank you, sir. But what you're saying is but there'll be no discussion of alternatives later on unless you feel there is a need to make modifications to the plan.
That's correct.
Thank you.
Mr. Lannis, do you want to come back now? Or?
Just very briefly, sir, I think with respect to Mr. Johnson's really raising a site-specific matter about the approach that's been taken to his site, applying the Greenbelt methodology, and it's not for this stage of the examination to consider that. To the extent that his site will be addressed at a later stage, then the appropriate boundary for that site is something which can be addressed then. As for other general points that were made, particularly in relation to individual sites being treated as reasonable alternatives, I can only say that the information that has been relied upon by the council is what it considered was before it at the time. So the reasons that were given for rejecting reasonable alternatives were judgments based on the information the council had before it when those decisions were made. As for the third point about the way in which decisions have been reached and the evidence being lacking for decisions that were taken, it gets back to a point that was raised at the earlier part of the session today, that the assessment work in any sort of local plan is bound to be carried across